My name is Forrest Gander. I'm a writer and translator. My most recent books are Twice Alive, An Ecology of Intimacies, a book of poems, and the translation, It Must Be a Misunderstanding, of the Mexican poet Corral Bracho, both from New Directions. I'll introduce the poets sort of with a question, so not all at once. And I think I'll start with Victoria. Victoria Chang has that rarest gift shared by the great Chilean poet Raul Zurita of being both a formal innovator in her field, what some people would call an experimental poet, and yet being accessible at the same time to a huge audience of readers. Her most recent books are Dear Memory, Writing, Silence, Grief, and the just published volume, will you hold it up? The Trees Witness Everything, in a skinny format, very pretty format. So Victoria, our panel is the Poetry of Exile. If there's a sense of exile in your work, it seems that it might be an exile from childhood. Your father dies young. Your mother, with whom you have a troubled relationship, dies after a long illness. Your identity as a singular personality fractures so that you come to say, all my selves, spread out like a deck of cards. But maybe it isn't just your childhood. In Dear Memory, you quote Salman Rushdie, noting that migrants are stripped of history. In some sense, would you say that in your writing, you struggle with the feeling of being exiled from your own identity?
Wow. Good morning. That's a great question. Thank you so much for the thoughtful reading. I think that I think you're right. I would say that I am exiled from myself and feel like, you know, if I were to use any metaphor, it'd be like a deck of cards that you just spread out, or I am so many selves that I don't know who I, who I am. And so that's sort of, but I don't know if that exile is a bad thing. It's just how I feel.
Achy, in Bumerán, Cuban-American Achy Obejas writes this sentence about love. It's not the world's most reliable sentiment, but yet it has an enduring appeal. Obejas does it all, fiction, poetry, journalism, translation, and she often does it in two languages, en una mezcla, a mix of those two languages, and in a gender-freeing form of Spanish that is only now being widely imagined, and about which we'll talk a bit later. Achy, because you not only immigrated to the US from Cuba as a child, but discovered as an adult how your family's Jewish history had been virtually obliterated by Christian totalitarianism, you seem to have the clearest connection to exile. And you write about it specifically. Exile, endurance and presence, the rat race, the real world, you write. It's the journey and the entity you sleep with every night. And yet at the same time, your sexual identity, your identity as a writer, your deep familiarity with ethnic communities in Chicago and here in California have emerged from living your life in the United States. I wonder if you think the enthusiastic reception of your books suggests that in some ways, many of us are in one way or another exiles.
I think most of us experience some sort of exile in some way. I often have a tussle with that word. You know, are you an exile if you never made the decision to leave in the first place? Which was my case. My parents made the decision to leave. I was 6, and so, you know, followed our parents. I know that when I went back to Cuba, a lot of things were forgiven by virtue of my not having made the decision. And the people would frequently lean down and whisper in my ear and say, "Your parents kidnapped you." And then somebody else, as if that were possible. And then somebody else would, lean down and say, "Thank your parents for taking you out of here." So, I don't know what I would have done. I don't know whether I would have made the same decision. And if I would have made the same decision, if my reasons would have been the same as my parents. My parents were very politically motivated to leave. My dad was wanted. And my mother very much wanted to live in a whiter country. She was trying desperately to get away from blackness. In fact, when we were in the United States and my dad started plotting a move to the Dominican Republic, my mother, without getting into a whole lot of detail, completely sabotaged him because the notion that my brother and I might hook up with black people really scared the shit out of her. It's one of those things, but yet I feel that exile is sort of inescapable for me. My home community is made up of people who, live a whole lot of their existence in their heads in the life that was, and also the life that might have been. I often feel like I have memories of Cuba that aren't mine, but that have become so embedded in the reality of my conversation, and my life with these people who are my family, that it's, it all meshes together. And when I go back to Cuba, I'm always acutely aware of the fact that it takes me a bit to meld. The first couple weeks, I'm too pale, I'm too stiff, my hips are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and so it takes me a bit. Once I'm there, I melt right in. But I'm also always aware of the fact that I am not of there, because I have an American passport in my pocket. I can solve problems for people by virtue of that passport and by virtue of my income, which, however modest it might be in the US, becomes, millionaire income in Cuba. So I always feel exile tugging one way or the other, whether I want it to or not. I mean, I don't know that I can ever fully get away from my Cubanness. It sort of follows me around. And Cuba's a fraught place, so that fraught place follows me around.
Yeah. Shangyang Fang's preposterously precocious first book, Burying the Mountain, will you hold it up? There we go. Is even better and shows more promise than the first book of his hero, Federico Garcia Lorca. True, it's really better. Casually steeped in references to art, music, and literature, it's clearly the first down payment on what will be a remarkable literary trajectory. I know you're excited about this question, Shangyang.
I'm scared.
So the title of our panel, Poetry of Exile. You're not yet 30, is that right?
Yes.
And you've lived in the United States for over 10 years, right?
10 years.
So your native language is Chinese, but your poetry language is English. Your erotic imagination, let loose in your English language poems, was suppressed in China. And in your poem, Meditation on an Authentic China, you write, "What is real here is the solitude of China, of not being understood." So, Shangyang, what kind of exile are you? And where do you feel most understood?
Well, that's a huge question. And where do I feel most understood? I think the exile is in all of us. When I started writing poems when I was a child, I was a kind of abandoned kid. So I rely on art and poetry to survive. And I think that sense of not being able to be understood by the social group, by my family, by where I grew up, that creates the sense I want to express. And I love the Ovid quote is that it's the kindness that the mind can go where it wishes to go. And I think that was where I first started this journey of exile. And then at that time, I think my perception of the reality is quite chaotic. Once I grasped a sense of the world, I was sent to United States alone, and my parents are still in China. My whole family is still in China right now. And then I started asking another question different from the Ovid one, which I will quote Hölderlin, the German poet, that he says, "Coming at home is through the passage of the foreign." So I always hold that line in my mind, what it means to be at home, what it means to be a foreigner in a country. And even you mentioned that the meditation on authentic China poem, that by the end of it, can I read the 2 sentences? Sure. We will try to return to where we are from and fail, and it's not because the landscape has been reassembled by factories or the early dreamscape has vanished into the misty air, preceding our tragic return, and having returned, we return to find we were never there. So I think this kind of thought in me, not knowing where I'm from and not knowing where I'm going, that kind of is the motivation, the impetus of my poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That comes up in your quote of the Japanese poem about looking for the...
Even, yeah, the Bashu poem, even in Kyoto, hearing a cuckoo's cry, I long for Kyoto. So,
and in Japanese, the cuckoo is the hototogusu, gisu, which is an onomatopoeic bird name. Brian, you ready? I'm ready. All right. Brian Tierney's newest book, will you hold it up, is Rise and Float from Milkweed Editions. Ricocheting quickly between the world of particulars and the mind's navigation of those particulars, his poems, often referencing family and friends, are stark and multiplex, characterized by an obsessively thoughtful energy. So, Brian, if you're some kind of poet of exile, and I'm not sure that you are, I'd say that your exile is psychological, a wormhole through which you find yourself falling out of the world. There are holes everywhere in these poems. In Polyphagia, you ask, how many ways can you fill a hole? Just before you find yourself falling through yourself like, quote, a skater through ice. Then there's a poem titled Fixing a Hole, and another called Ideation, about being inside a hole that will not go all the way to the other side. Why the psychological dark holes in your poems? What is on the other side of them?
Wow. You know, I never, until this panel, I never thought about exile at all in relation to my identity or life experience or poetry. And, but I think in some ways, there's this line in one of the poems, I'm never where my body is. And I think there's a way in which a lot of the book has to do with self-alienation and being kind of through mental illness, which a lot of the book deals with, and grief, being very disconnected from a sense of a stable self. And, you know, a lot of this book is memory and elegy, kind of combining. And I think, you know, Ed Hirsch talks about elegy as it originates in the unspeakable and touches the unfathomable. And there's a way in which a lot of the characters and family members in the book, even though it might seem, if anybody's read it, it might seem as if I knew them, a lot I didn't know, and their stories predated me. And there's a lot of suicide and addiction and other mental health related problems across my family on both sides. And so a lot of the book was also being kind of alienated from my family's narrative. And so there's a way in which I guess if you really pull taffy-like the idea of exile into something related to psychology, mental health, family, sense of self, I think a lot of it was trying to reconnect with origin stories that were kept from me. You know, they were intensely guarded family dramas and narratives as a kid, involving suicide and things that I could sense were being talked about, were being referenced, but they were afraid it would be like a disease that would pass to me or something. Uh-huh. And so I think there were holes in the stories of my origins. And so a lot of the book is trying to kind of make sense of stories that I can only piece together through what has been passed down to me, colliding with, of course, expressions of my own sense of having inherited some of that struggle, and, you know, oftentimes feeling like there's an emptiness, right? And I think that's the thing about elegy, you know, it ritualizes grief in a really interesting way, that allows you to kind of survive.
That's really a beautiful answer. Shangyang, you mentioned Ovid in your last response. And
Now you make me feel I shouldn't.
no, my next question has to do with Ovid.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so just wonderful coincidence. As we know, the Roman poet Ovid was exiled. I think of him because there's so many curious Ovidian metamorphoses in your book. In one poem, you describe a dog that won't bite, and then you announce, but there is no dog. It's just a puddle in the middle of the road, which I have mistaken for a dog. In another poem, a woman wants to become a cello. In another, you describe a Greek boy who ran and fell and drowned by the seashore when catching fish, but people insist he's a ship. And in Chacon, in order to save a swarm of ants from his own fingers, the protagonist becomes one of the ants. I wonder if your imagination of metamorphosis is connected to exile, or really, as I suspect, to desire, which is really the theme of your book. In your experience, does erotic desire transform us?
That's a great question. Well, I think desire, one of the great things, it leads to transformation and metamorphosis. It makes us, even in many of those Ovid pieces, that we realize we're bigger than we are and we're smaller than we are. I think it's what love can do to you, where you cast yourself outside your own body and flying to the other. And about my metaphors in my poems, I think we talked about that in the emails. I thought sometimes I just mistake the things I see because I have bad vision. When a person walked toward me holding a folded black umbrella, I thought it was a black dog on leash. And I think sometimes metaphor occurs to me when I misread the reality. And I think, yeah, that's so interesting because I trust sometimes imagination more than the surrounding where I'm at. So I think that's probably one of the things of my poetry, yeah.
That's going to come up later, I think, the way that human culture now, especially Western culture, has never been so logocentric as it is now, that our language is used almost only for transactional reasons and for language of information. But in all of human cultures, prior to right now, there were other forms of language that made sense, and those were connected to poetry, shamanism, healing, visionary practices.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I remember one of my old professor, Jane Miller, when she was teaching us the level of description. And it's a long lesson, but basically you start from naming a thing, physical description, simile, metaphor, in between the simile and metaphor, synecdoche, metonym, and then symbol, archetype, and cliche. I was teaching that in a workshop last night, but so interestingly, she said that the highest that we can get nowadays in contemporary writing, easy for us to get, is metaphors. It's hard for us to go into that realm of symbolism, archetype, because that symbols nowadays, as they are connected to ideas rather than metaphor and simile, connecting objects together, symbolism falls into a kind of tribalism, that different things means so differently to each other, and the boundary shuts us down and shuts the vigor of the language down somehow.
Victoria, I wanted to ask use something. I've been thinking about how humans from our beginning have evolved listening to birds. Virtually all Homo sapiens, everyone here included, grew up with birdsong in their ears and brains. Birds, owls, hawks, and crows come up frequently in your poems. They seem to be your talismanic companions, but rarely for their songs. You write, "To love so much is to live within birds." Is it the fact of their mere presence as creatures? Do you see them as symbols of your relation with the non-human? What draws birds into your poems so frequently?
I feel so much pressure. Everyone's so thoughtful and eloquent, and not yet 30. This is kind of miraculous. But I think a lot about Bridget P. Jean Kelly's book, Song, where I've heard people say this, I've never actually counted, but I think there's supposed to be a bird or some reference to a bird in every single poem in that book. But I don't know if anyone's ever fact-checked that, and maybe I should go do that. I'm curious myself now, but there are a lot of birds in that book, and I feel like somehow, without really having ever spoken to Bridget P. Jean Kelly about her relationship to birds and animals in general, I feel like I have that relationship, a similar relationship to birds. I oftentimes think, and animals too, I sometimes think that I think humans are disappointing and ultimately...
Just sometimes?
Yeah, ultimately failures, and that animals and creatures and birds are somehow more noble than we are. But I don't even know if that's true when I think about it, if it's too much kind of projecting the human onto the animal. But for me, I think birds represent a sense of freedom that I often don't feel like I have. And I feel oftentimes caged, as a human myself. And so I think perhaps birds represent that kind of free thinking. Maybe birds are more representative of my mind. So I feel like my mind is very free and constantly able to do and think and imagine. Imagination, as what you said earlier, really resonated with me. I feel like that's probably how I live more happily in my brain and in my imagination than I do in real life. And maybe birds, represent that.
That's so fascinating, Victoria. I want to have some tequila with you and hear more about that. Okay, I'll take the tequila. Achy, so we just talked about this a little bit, but it's super fascinating for me, and I think will be for the audience. Although sometimes you want gender to be explicit, there are hermanas y malhechoras in your book, you generally make an effort in this book, in the Spanish section of this unusual book, which includes the same text in English and Spanish. She reworks the gender markers, the articles and the A or O endings in Spanish that define certain Spanish words as feminine or masculine. So instead of la vida, you write le vida. Instead of sus hijos, you write sus hijes. This may be one of the most trailblazing attempts to alter the conventions of a language ever made in such a short time. Can you tell us a little bit about the aspirations for altering the inherited structure of a language, what you call at one point the choice of rupture?
This is something that actually evolved during the course of the book. The original manuscript for the book didn't do that. But I'd been thinking about it a lot. I'd been very much haunted by this idea that we were doomed to gender in the Romance languages, that we have to just contend with it, English is so flexible in, so many ways. You can invent and sort of play with language in a way that's harder to do with the kind of lexicon that you have in Spanish, and also the gendering just completely, saturates everything, because you're not just gendering people, you're gendering the table, and you're gendering the glass, and you're gendering the mask and the chair and everything. Everything is gendered.
Well, you used that example that you used in the last class.
Oh, when I said, a lot of the attempts to degender and using the E have only really looked at degendering individuals, people, not just nouns, specifically people. And the rest of the language remains gendered. So you have this degendered person, friend, sitting in a
Gendered.
very gendered, feminine, chair, holding a masculine microphone, and wearing a very nice female, feminine jacket. And so I couldn't figure out the utility for this. What is the point? Why is the microphone? Well, I can kind of sort of figure out why it's masculine.
Except clitoris is, yeah.
But, other words don't make sense. Like, in Spanish, clitoris is el clitoris, which it makes, when you think about it, what could be more feminine than a clitoris? So, this was sort of daunting, and I just decided, I'm just going to undo it all. And it was interesting, some of the responses to the book have been really curious. Like, this one woman said, I loved your poetry. I hated what you did with the language. And one of her big objections was that I took the words to Carlos Gardel tango, a very famous tango, and I degendered his tango. And she was like, how can you do that to a classic? But that's kind of the point, isn't it? To undo that kind of thing. It's all classic. And I wanted very much to try to see what it felt like to be completely degendered. One of the things that happened was that I realized, in some cases, gender was important to keep. That, in order to really tell the story, the gendered experience of the individual at hand was important. Like, for example, there's a poem about Ana Mendieta, who was this very wonderful...
I'm going to ask you about her next.
Yeah, okay. This very wonderful artist who really suffered a great deal in the art world by virtue of being a woman, and specifically about being a woman of color. And she either fell out a window or was murdered by her husband in a way that's very sort of typically, domestic violence, terrorist thing that happens to women. And so I ended up degendering everything in the poem but her, because her experience as a woman was crucial to the experience and to the understanding of her situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Hey, Brian. So your sentencing is often surprisingly complex and recursive. A single sentence can move like a snake around lots of canny punctuation, commas, semicolons, dashes, coordinating conjunctions. This single sentence from one of your poems is kind of exemplary. And so indulgence came to me week after week, comma, opening its hand like a late-night diner menu, comma, impossible with options, comma, page after page, comma, so many words for appetite, comma, so many preparations, colon, the simplest white plate, comma, spent bones in a bramble, comma, fly's eyes lit glistening on the gristle, comma, it did not disgust me, comma, the thought. In what ways do you think this kind of complex sentencing models your thinking process or your sense of reality?
Wow, yeah. I love that you went to that poem too. I think for that poem specifically, which is related to binge eating and bulimia and eating disorders, I kind of wanted it to be about accumulation, and accumulation that becomes neurotic, becomes obsessive, and almost takes over the thought. And to me, that felt like, on a language level, an expression of an experience with food and my body image and my relation to literally putting things in my body that you sort of lose control over. So I think in that poem specifically, it serves a certain purpose. In other poems, I think it maybe does reflect a way of seeing the world in which I often find I think associatively, I see associatively, and I want to be making leaps and connections between all kinds of things. Sometimes I do it and I don't even know I do it, and then you kind of step back from the poem and it's there, and then you can kind of go back to it and shape it and make it something more deliberate. But I'm thinking of even Shangyang saying, metaphors occur to me when I misread the reality. And I think there's a way in which, when I'm writing, I want to not be able to anticipate where the sentence ends, where the thought ends, where the image ends. Because even in the book, there's times when I want to push an image as far as it can go, where it's no longer an image, it's like a discursive kind of signifier of some kind that's beyond just an image or a symbol. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's something that has shifted a little. I think working on a second book, the syntax is different. It's quieter. So maybe it had to do with this book reflecting, to some extent, engagement with mental health and mental illness, where some of the book is dealing with kind of para-insanity and kind of a loss of control of emotion, a disordered mind, and a relationship of disorder to the body.
So that makes sense. It also makes sense as, your poems are very energetic, and they seem to be like these currents of, like a current of water that's dragging in stuff from all over. It sort of keeps picking up different aspects of reality, and like you say, doesn't quite stop where we're expecting it to. And so that constant surprise is one of the pleasures of the work, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I love that image of the river kind of exceeding its bank and pulling things into it.
Yeah.
And there is that kind of ecstatic thing that happens, which I think, I grew up Catholic. I'm no longer Catholic, but I grew up Catholic. And I think there's a way in which there is a kind of ecstatic mode that one experiences, both in the ritual of being in a Catholic Mass, which is very beautiful and strange, that kind of has stuck with me, even though I'm not a religious person anymore. I think there is that kind of strange religiosity to some of the logic of language and syntax in the book.
Go back a little bit. In your book obit, you segue from, I'm talking to you, so I'm not going to look at the audience and talk to them. So you segue from skinny prose poems that look like obituaries to tankas. And for me, the tankas in that book worked almost like palate cleansers between the obits. They kind of cleared the rhythmic space and prepared you for a new series. The tankas in that book, and you include a poem whose title, I Am a Miner, The Light Burns Blue, is borrowed from Sylvia Plath. In her new book, hold up again, The Trees Witness Everything, most of the poems are tankas or other short Japanese forms, and the titles are borrowed from the poet W.S. Merwin. Although you mentioned this in the introduction of your book, would you mind telling the audience something about your attraction to Japanese forms and to your adoption of titles by other poets?
Yeah, so when I finished finished is a strange word. One never really finishes anything. But when I stopped and halted writing the obituary poems, which were shaped like rectangles, and other people have said they look like coffins, I just stopped writing for a while, and that just makes me very unhappy and also very uncomfortable, which I'm sure anyone can relate to if you write. And so I started writing some formal poems just for, to feel alive again, I suppose. And so, one of my friends, who's one of my early readers of my work, said that they're really awful, so you should get rid of all of them. But these little poems, and I mimicked his voice because he's very excitable, but these little poems, you keep these little poems, and then I kept the little poems, the tankas, and put them in the back, and then he saw it again. He's like, why are these little poems in the back? And so he said, you need to spread them out. And so I just spread them out, and they became little rests, breathers of the more heavily laden material of grief, I suppose. And then when I finished that book, he said, I really like those little poems. You should write a whole little collection of little poems, 40 pages.
This is a very influential friend.
Yeah, he's very influential. But yeah, and he and I said, he said 40 pages, and he's also very specific. And so I did. I said, sure, because I don't usually write that way, with something to start with, even though the Obit book may seem that way, it definitely wasn't that way. So I did do that. I didn't quite follow the assignment, though. I gave myself yet another restriction, which is to use W.S. Merwin's titles, because, just of how open they are. I mean, they're the most incredible titles. What we call it, The Singer, Division, Completion, The First Year. I mean, I could go Witness, Threshold. I mean, they're really how we are spared. They're just really broad.
Would you read one, if you can find it quickly, the To Age or Do Light?
Oh, okay. Let's see. Do you know where they are?
I didn't put the page number.
Okay. To Age is on page 43. So
Just for the openness of this is such a surprising poem from this title.
To Age. When the stars hit the windows now, they turn into flies. Who knew they would come down? I don't remember the other ones. So I won't read it.
I just love that with the title, how it resonates.
And the titles really, and plus the syllabics, really opened up the possibilities. And after writing a book like Obit, I really wanted to see if I could inhabit someone else's brain and someone else's mind, and also to eliminate subject matter, if possible, because this was such a subject matter heavy book in terms of the constant hammering of grief. And so that's sort of how those things came together. But I think I followed his instructions mostly, but the book is how many pages long? It's too long. And he would have said it was too long. It's 123 pages. So I tripled it.
If you start reading it, I promise you can't stop until you really, it has this force. Achy, I promised you I was going to talk about Mendieta. In Le Presidente de la Coca-Cola, you canonize the innovative artist Ana Mendieta, crediting her with pretty much everything that constitutes contemporary culture, and reimagining her death, her murder, in a last image of her body not lifeless on the roof of the deli where she fell, but only dozing on the roof. Alive then, and with us still. Can you tell those in the audience who don't know her work why you might identify with her and why her work is so important and has been rediscovered and celebrated?
Well, Anna was actually someone I knew.
Oh, no me.
I didn't know her well, but we inhabited the same little group of friends. She was in New York, and the rest of us were in Chicago, and it was a very sort of wild time for me, because historically, what I'd known about Cubans in the United States was that politically we seemed to be outside of the realm of the left, and there was a lot of fear about us being right-wing crazies. But I had always identified with the left, and I had always been very engaged in social justice issues, and had never met other Cubans who did that. And then when I moved to Chicago in the early 80s, met these folks, and Anna was part of this crowd. And it was the reason she was so important to us was because she really embodied a freedom, a way to think of being in the world that took our experiences as displaced people into consideration, but didn't fall into the general stereotypes. And Anna was very much about going back and about figuring things out for ourselves, and we all eventually did go back. Her work was really exceptional in its time in the 80s because she used her own body, she used the earth. A lot of her sculptures are versions of her body on, in the earth and in the landscape. She used her blood. She used a lot of her own self in peril to really discuss how we belong, where we belong, and a lot of it had to do with very, very female sort of thinking about spirituality and the earth. And it curiously, many years later, I had a relationship with an artist, Tania Bruguera, who is a really phenomenal performance artist, whose very first sort of international work was recreating all of Anna's pieces long after Anna had died, recreating all of Anna's pieces in Cuba as a way of reintegrating her into Cuban art history and to sort of have her be a part of Cuba again. And it was very controversial work for a lot of reasons, but in Cuba in particular, it was problematic because Tania was someone who lived in Cuba and whose family was very embedded in the nomenclature of the revolution, and here she was reclaiming someone who had left as an exile. So it was a really powerful piece. So I feel like I've been surrounded by Anna both in person and through other people in a lot of ways, and her work is still, to me, very awe-inspiring.
Riveting, really important. So we're coming down to, say, 5 more minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Brian, I have another question for you. You've talked about the darkness of this book, but there are moments of tenderness that pop out in the poems again and again. But the undercurrent is this stark, even violent scenarios. There are poems about your father dying, dreams about your own dying, your mother dying, your dead uncle, friends jumping off bridges, you poised at a guardrail, a kid torn apart by Dobermans. This is a childhood you didn't want to share. A relative asphyxiated in a car, your great-grandfather's nervous breakdowns, Robert Frost's corpse, the wreck of a psychiatric hospital, a concept for pain, a lot of really hard stuff. It's kept from being sort of gruesome by the alive language of his work. But I wondered, characters from one poem appear in others. You've just mentioned that not all of them you actually knew. But in ways, it's sort of like a postmodern Spoon River anthology. Would you say Rise and Float is a book about this moment in history, not just your moment, dark and turbulent, but told through the filter of your family and friends?
I love that. Wow. A postmodern Spoon River. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's different. It's obviously doing something way different, but yeah, I think we're all, everything that all of us write, right, to some extent, is born of the moment we live in. So I think that's true probably for all of us, even if that's like a counter to that moment, with like Victoria's latest book, where there's a certain kind of like calm to it. or it's something maybe like my book, which admittedly, as you were reading off all of those despairing, grotesque aspects, there's also that part of it too. But I don't know. I mean, I think the book is pretty dark in that I had to go through, I think Stanley Kunitz said in one of his poems, you have to go through dark and deeper dark and not to turn, which I think is a really powerful and beautiful sentiment for anybody who's lost a lot of people or anybody significant. But it took me a long time to get past the accumulation of losses, because there are many people I did know who died in the book, including my father. And it took a long time to have enough distance from that to see something beautiful that lies behind or underneath loss. And it is the idea that you grieve so deeply because you love so deeply, right? I think that, and sometimes it's more complicated. Some people die and you grieve and you didn't have a good relationship with them. And so you grieve deeply for another kind of intense reason. But I do hope that the tenderness comes out in the book and kind of is the foil to the darkness, because, it seems real easy to say both coexist, because we kind of know that. That's our life experience for everyone. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a fractured book. And I think the characters come in that Spoon River kind of way that you mentioned, where you never get the whole story, but you get little bits of the story that accumulate across the poems. And I wanted that to be an intimacy. I hope that would invite people into my own story without having to it be a memoir, which kind of tries to be all-encompassing, where this book really doesn't. It's sort of giving you fresh splinters of things that you can make a kind of mosaic that makes sense of an individual experience of reading the book, as opposed to me forcing you to come away with a certain whole narrative.
Yeah. And that's splintering. I mean, it feels like it's a book about America as well as it is the illnesses of America as well as the illnesses within a family. I thought the darkness and the tenderness, the ray of hope. But
yeah, I think there is certainly at least one version of Americanness, which is we're a sick place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Sick in many ways, but I think mental health-wise we're iller, it seems like, than other places for a reason.
Shangyang, let me ask you a quick question.
Yes.
And you have to answer quickly so we can listen to the audience.
Yes.
In one poem, you describe a woman undressing in a mirror, noting, as if by giving up her shape, she expressed her shape fully. In other words, by giving up herself, she most completely becomes herself. In another poem, you write something similar. You say, in fact, you write that you write to make myself unrecognized. I'm wondering if that's the same thing. Is it when you give shape to your writing that you become both who you are meant to be and unrecognizable to yourself?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I can't remember the woman undressing. I think I wrote that poem when I was a sophomore in college, so that's very distant from me. That's my cousin also, but I agree. I mean, I think it's Kundera who said that the writing to make myself unrecognized. That's one of my firm beliefs. I believe that Kundera is right when he talked about that the writer should disappear behind their work. So I believe in that. I think that's a form of freedom in the work. I can talk about more, but we'll give the time to the audience.
So let's see, I'm supposed to announce something, and then let me announce that these incredible books by these authors will be available at East Wind Books tent, East Wind Books, in the park at 2:15. And if there's a fire, you should run out that door. So are there questions from the audience? Yes.
I was exile when it's freely chosen versus. I was wondering if you could talk about how exile is how it's experienced differently when it's freely chosen versus when it's not.
And Achy mentioned that. Others? Or?
For me, well, I'll just say, for me it's more complicated. It's, my family sent me out and I'm here alone for 10 years. It's more complicated than I chose it and or I was forced into this. But one thing I can say that about writing in a second language, which I am right now, there's so much more, the language in front of you is more materialized than my native language, that it's more malleable, and I'm able to say something that I just cannot say in my native tongue. And I don't, well, there's politics in it, but I think that's just a nature, that being with something less familiar, you're inviting yourself to a new self somehow.
I mean, I think that question of choosing or not choosing exile is really vital, and I do think it shapes the experience. I mean, I think my parents experienced exile in a very different way. They were very committed and invested in their decision in a way that was very different for me, you know. I know that the first time I went back to Cuba, they were terrified. And it wasn't that the terror was about anything that could happen to me. It was about how I might come and sort of reevaluate their position. And it, you know, the more I went back to Cuba, because I kept going back. I lived in Cuba for a while as an adult, which was really problematic for them in a lot of ways. There was a shift in the family that became really hard to manage in a lot of ways, which was that the kingdom of details about Cuba shifted from them to me. You know, I was the one who had a really sort of fresh sense, which is not to say that, you know, that I had any kind of, you know, broad statement to make, but it was like the expertise, if you want to call it that, very subtly shifted in the family. Like cousins would ask me, aunts and uncles would ask me. And we did have this one moment, my mom and I, that was really painful but very tender, in which she was talking about an experience she'd had, and the experience took place in Havana. And at this point, my mom had actually spent more than half her life in the United States and had never been back. And it was her political position to not go back. And she named the place where this supposedly took place and an intersection. And I knew that those two streets did not intersect. And my parents were big on correcting us when we said things wrong in Spanish or when we got things slightly off historically or something like that. But there was this moment that was sort of suspended while I chose not to say anything, and she chose not to notice that I chose not to say anything, so that she could still have her memory and her moment. But it was really a tough one, you know. I do think that when you make a decision like that, you spend a lot of time rationalizing it and justifying it. You know, I left because of this. I didn't leave because of this. Because as much as you leave for a reason, you also leave for not necessarily the reasons that are assigned to you. You know, for my mom, for example, it was a very big deal to make sure that people knew that she wasn't a millionaire who had left many properties behind. And she would always say, I'm from the center of the country. My parents were, you know, a railroad worker and a seamstress. We didn't leave any properties. We were poor, simple people. So I think those kinds of things are very different for me. I ride their decision.
One more question? Yes.
Thank you. First of all, this is a beautiful whole conversation and sharing, and I thank everyone. Question for Shangyang. You were talking earlier about a class you were taking or teaching, and that when you get to the something about the English language and the trouble right now relative to symbol and archetype. And I wonder, could you clarify who was saying that? That was very compelling. Thank you.
That was from my previous teacher, Jane Miller, and it's one of the class where she was teaching us the hierarchies of description. And once we start by, the table, the physical aspect of the table, it's gray, it's square, it's rectangular. And when we arrive at the cliche, she says, there's nothing that is cliche. Cliche is the most public privacy, I think. And that when we arrive at cliche, we will go back to the first level of description to re-examine the table, the reality again. That's her teaching, but it's not written down anywhere, so it's really just a class. Yeah.
One more quick question? All right. Oh, yes.
What was the name of the Cuban artist, the last name of Anna's last name?
Ana Mendieta.
Mendieta.
Yeah, Mendieta.
Thank you so much.
Could you give a hand, please, to Forrest? He is the most amazing moderator. And those were very, very thoughtful and wonderfully intelligent questions. Thank you so much.
Achy.
He makes us look good.